She was only 8 years old, her small frame shivering against the soaked blades of grass. Her hand reached out blindly, desperate for the crutch ripped from her grip moments before. The night echoed with her broken plea. "Please, give it back. I can't stand without it." But mercy never came. Only the shadow of cruelty loomed larger, feeding on her weakness. What she could not see was that beyond the iron gates, salvation was already racing toward her. Lieutenant Mark Daniels and his loyal partner, Bruno, the German Shepherd, following a signal no one else had heard. This is not just the story of a rescue. It's about faith, courage, and a bond strong enough to stitch the deepest wounds. Stay with me until the end, because the ending may not be what you expect. The rain blurred the hills into softness, as if the town itself bowed its head for comfort. Along Maple Crest Road, the mansions glowed like gilded lanterns behind dripping hedges, their driveways cluttered with polished cars waiting like silent guests. At the boulevard's end, the Hale estate shone brightest. Music spilled from its manicured garden, violins trembling through the rain, mingling with laughter that belonged to another world. On ordinary nights, this house was a symbol of power, safety, polish. But tonight, its marble heart would be carved with a scar that could never fade. Lieutenant Mark Daniels eased his patrol SUV beneath an elm that bent in the damp wind. At 38, he carried the look of a man weathered but not broken. Broad shoulders sculpted by duty, a jawline set in quiet defiance, and storm-water eyes that searched as if every shadow carried a secret. Once, long ago, his face had known easy smiles. But tragedy had pressed weight into his frame, a sister lost too soon, an ambulance that came too late. That night became his oath. Never hesitate when someone needs you. On the passenger seat, Bruno shifted. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, a soldier wrapped in fur, his black and tan coat gleaming even under weak streetlight, his chest broad, his gaze calm and unflinching. A faint streak of gray marked his muzzle, the signature of years spent standing between danger and the innocent. And tonight, innocence was crying in the rain. But what no one expected, what even Mark could not see, was that this mission would not end with a simple rescue. Because when the gates burst open and Bruno leapt forward into the storm, the hunter waiting in the shadows was not just tormenting a child, he was waiting for them. His amber eyes glowed with patience, though they could turn sharp in a heartbeat. He wore his canine vest comfortably, and beneath his collar, a small camera blinked a steady green, recording faithfully. Bruno had his own story, rescued from a failed breeder, trained as a K9 when others doubted his spirit. Now he was Mark's partner and sometimes the steadier of the two. The call had come, scrambled through dispatch. A weak 911 and connection. Static wrapped around a child's plea. The GPS pinged not from a phone, but from a small children's. Smartwatch registered to an Emma Grace, 8 years old. The note in the system said, "Mobility device required. Accident survivor. Father, Staff Sergeant Liam Grace, currently deployed." Was overseas. That line had caught Mark like a hook. He knew the look of children left behind by war. He had seen them in living rooms, in classrooms, clutching photographs like lifelines. "Ready?" Mark asked softly. Bruno nudged. His wrist, a gesture both answer and reassurance. The cruiser rolled past the row-iron gates of the Hale estate. The drive curved up toward a mansion of pale stone, its facade glowing beneath strings of golden light. Valets in crisp jackets hurried to and fro, parking cars that cost more than most homes. Guests in gowns and tuxedos filled the garden pavilion, their voices rising in effortless chatter. Glasses clinked-kecked, jewels flashed. Somewhere, a quartet played a piece that was supposed to soothe, but instead reminded Mark how thin the line was between order and pretense. Vanessa Hale glided through the crowd like a swan in a man-made lake. She was 35, statuesque, blonde, hair swept into a flawless bun, pearls resting perfectly at her throat. Her dress was bright yellow, chosen to shine. In photographs, to strangers, she looked like elegance. To those closer, her smile sometimes cut more than it warmed. She had married into the Hale name with ambition, and she wore the role of hostess like a crown she intended never to lose. But the watch signal drew Mark, away from the lights, down a darker slope of the garden, where the music thinned into mist. He felt the weight of rain in his coat, the earth softening beneath his boots. Bruno moved ahead, head low, reading sense invisible to human sense. They passed the fountain where water mingled with rainfall, and beyond its shadows, Mark's breath caught. There on the damp grass was a little girl. Emma Grace was small, her body slight, the way children who grow up, with hospitals often are. Her hair, chestnut brown, clung wet to her cheeks. She wore a simple brown cotton dress, dotted with daisies now stained with mud. One crutch lay discarded yards away. The other she clutched to her ribs, like it might keep her alive. Her legs trembled as she tried to push herself upright, determination and despair, twisting together. She was sobbing, words broken between gasps. "Please give it back. I can't stand without it." Towering above her was Vanessa, the dress blazing against the wet night. She did not bend. Her face was a mask of annoyance more than concern, as if Emma's struggle were an inconvenience. Mark's voice rang across the lawn. "Police, step back from the child." Vanessa turned sharply. Surprise flickered in her eyes, then vanished beneath practiced calm. She smiled, though her jaw was tight. "Officer, everything is fine." She fell. "That's all." Bruno placed himself between Emma and Vanessa, his body coiled but controlled, ears erect, eyes locked. He did not growl. He didn't need to. His presence was a wall. Mark knelt by Emma. Up close, he saw the faint scars laddering her calf, reminders of surgeries that had rebuilt what fate had broken. Her hands were small, trembling, but her eyes, hazel and too old for her years, met his with both fear and hope. "I'm Mark," he said gently. "This is Bruno. He's very good at guarding people who need him." Emma's lips quivered, but she gave a tiny nod. Bruno lowered his head, brushing against her arm, grounding her in a warmth no words could match. "Ma'am, step back," Mark ordered Vanessa, his tone firmer now, hands visible. Vanessa's smile cracked, anger spilling through. "This is my property, officer. My stepdaughter is dramatic. She enjoys." "Enough," Mark said. He rose, retrieved the fallen crutch, and returned it to Emma's reach. Her small hands closed around it, finding balance again. That moment, so ordinary, so sacred, tightened something in his chest. He had given her more than wood and rubber. He had given her dignity. Guests under the pavilion had begun to notice, their voices tapering into whispers. The quartet faltered. It was no longer just rain that hushed the night. It was truth intruding where masks lived. Emma swallowed hard, voice raw. "I called from my watch." Mark's throat tightened. "That was brave. You did the right thing." He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 3. Confirm juvenile victim potential. Neglect. Request EMS at the Hale Estate rear garden." The response crackled through. "Copy. Unit 3. Vanessa hissed, her composure fracturing. "She ruins everything. Always clinging. Always. Liam left me with this." Mark's eyes hardened. Not another word. Bruno shifted, eyes never leaving Vanessa. The air grew heavier. Behind the glass doors of the house, servants peered out, uncertain. A housekeeper hurried down the steps, linen towel clutched to her chest. Maria Alvarez, mid-50s, small. Gray hair pinned neatly, lines etched deep from years of labor and worry. She knelt beside Emma, draping the towel across her shoulders with trembling hands. "Sweetheart," she whispered, voice thick with suppressed fear. "You're safe now." Mark met her gaze, silent but understanding. He would need her testimony later. For now, compassion mattered more. Emma leaned into the towel, into Bruno, into any scrap of safety the moment offered. Her breathing eased, though her hands never left the crutch. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing nearer. Relief and tension wore in Mark's chest. He had done, and his part, intervened, protected, restored what little dignity the girl could hold tonight. But this was only the beginning. As paramedics hurried across the lawn, Mark gave one final look at the mansion, its glowing windows, its carefully staged perfection, its guests now murmuring behind half-lifted glasses. And in the middle of it all, a child had cried for help. No one but a machine had heard. Not tonight, he thought, not anymore. He lifted his gaze to Emma. "Your father's name is Liam, isn't it?" She nodded faintly, clutching Bruno's fur with her free hand. "He's far away, but he says not to fear the rain." Mark swallowed. "Then tonight, well make. Sure he knows you're safe." Bruno exhaled softly, a sound like agreement, and together, under the rain-blurred lights of Brighton Hills, they began the long walk out of the garden toward the ambulance waiting at the gate. The sirens doled as the ambulance pulled into the wide circular drive of Riverbend General Hospital. the largest medical center in Brighton Hills. Fluorescent lights hummed over the entrance, reflecting on the slick pavement. The hospital rose in glass and steel, coldly modern, but somehow reassuring in its sheer size. Inside, the halls carried the smell of antiseptic, and voices echoed with urgency and exhaustion. Lieutenant Mark Daniels stepped down from the rig, rein still, clinging to his jacket. He followed the gurney as paramedics wheeled Emma Grace through the sliding doors. Emma clutched, her crutch with one hand, her other hand gripping a patch of Bruno's fur as though he were the anchor holding her in this world. Bruno paced beside the stretcher, his vest damp, paws silent on the tile, amber eyes flicking to every passerby as if daring them to come too close. In the exam room, a pediatrician arrived quickly. Dr. Mia Park, early 30s, with dark hair tied back in a bun that had begun to loosen under a 12-hour shift, wore pale blue scrubs. She had a kind, open face, warm brown eyes framed by faint shadows of sleepless nights. There was a gentle steadiness to her voice, the sort born from years of calming children who didn't want needles, and parents who didn't want bad news. She greeted Emma softly, crouching to eye level. "Hi, sweetheart, I'm Dr. Park. I'm going to check you out." "All right, nothing scary, I promise." Emma gave the faintest nod. Mark stood nearby, arms folded, expression stern, but not directed at her. He was watching, weighing every detail. Dr. Park examined Emma carefully. She noted bruises along the tibia and faint older ones near the ribs, patterns inconsistent with play or accidental falls. She checked Emma's vitals, then murmured to the nurse. Signs of neglect, prolonged stress. Her voice was quiet, but Mark caught every word. When Dr. Park asked Emma to breathe deep, Bruno rested his head on the edge of the bed. The dog's warm breath reached Emma's arm, grounding her. For the first time in months, her eyelids sagged, her body loosening as she leaned against the pillow. Sleep began to claim her in small waves. Mark realized he was watching a miracle, a child who had been forced to stay vigilant, finally letting herself rest because a dog stood watch. Outside the room, Mark met with Nora Whitman, the hospital's assigned social worker. Nora was in her mid-40s, a woman of medium height with curly auburn hair pulled into a loose bun. Her glasses perched low on her nose, and she wore a gray cardigan over a simple blouse. Nora's face carried the gentle fatigue of someone who had seen too many children hurt by those meant to protect them. Her voice was calm, measured, but inside every syllable was a steel determination. "Lieutenant Daniels," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been briefed. Emma Grace is now under emergency protective status until we sort this out." Mark nodded. "She's safe tonight. That's what matters." Nora's eyes softened at that. "You care more than most officers I meet. That makes this easier." Before Mark could reply, another woman joined them. Alicia Ward, the county prosecutor, arrived still in her trench coat, rain dripping from her dark curls. She was in her late 30s, sharp-featured with a gaze that had unsettled more than a few defendants. She carried herself like someone who had fought her way up flights of courthouse stairs and refused to ever walk back down. Her lips curved into the faintest wry smile. "Daniels," she said, extending a hand. "You have a habit of stumbling into the cases that keep me up at night." "Happy to help your insomnia," Mark answered dryly. Alicia smirked, then grew serious. "I'll need every detail. If Vanessa Hale has been abusing this child, I want airtight evidence before we move for custody revocation." Mark's jaw tightened. "I've sealed their garden cameras. We'll get footage. But neglect like this doesn't just hide in shadows. It leaves traces everywhere." As they spoke, Bruno padded into the waiting area, shaking off rain, then sat squarely beside Mark. His amber eyes swept the room, calm but alert. Nora smiled faintly. "That dog may make this easier for Emma than any of us could." Later that night, Mark escorted Bruno back to the patrol SUV. Rain tapped against the hood as he opened the rear door for the dog. Bruno leapt in gracefully, shook once, then began sniffing around the seats. His nose pressed under the passenger seat, then into the shadows beneath the driver's side. Suddenly, he stopped, tail stiff, head cocked. Mark leaned closer. "What is it, boy?" Bruno pawed lightly, then withdrew with something clenched between his teeth. A small USB drive, the casing, black and scuffed. Mark frowned, taking it with a gloved hand. Sliding further, under the seat, Bruno nosed out a crumpled piece of paper, damp but still legible. Mark unfolded it beneath the glow of the dome light. The handwriting was sharp, feminine, numbers and dates. Scribbled across the page alongside the name Merritt Hall, a local real estate magnate with a reputation for circling vulnerable estates like a vulture. At the bottom, scrolled in Vanessa Hale's handwriting, custody first, deed second. Mark's jaw tightened. This wasn't just cruelty. This was conspiracy. Vanessa wanted control over Emma, not out of love, but for money. For property belonging to the Grace family, while Emma's father was thousands of miles away. He slipped both items into an evidence bag, sealing it tight. Bruno wagged his tail once, proud of his discovery. "Good boy," Mark whispered. "You just cracked the first piece of this puzzle." Bruno pressed his head into Mark's palm, eyes glowing with simple trust. In that moment, Mark felt the storm outside and inside him quiet a fraction. He wasn't alone in this fight. Back inside Riverbend, Nora met Mark with a clipboard. "Emma's stable. Dr. Park recommends observation overnight. We'll arrange temporary placement until we secure a safer environment. Unless the father can be reached quickly," Mark exhaled. "Staff. Sergeant Liam Grace is deployed. We'll have to notify him through military channels." Alicia Ward stepped in, her coat now dry, a stack of files under her arm. "Get me that USB in the paper. If there's evidence Vanessa is scheming over Emma's inheritance, we'll bring financial crimes into this case. Judges love paper trails." Mark handed her the sealed bag. Bruno found it under Vanessa's seat. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "Smart dog. He's more than that," Mark said. "He's the reason Emma closed her eyes for the first time without fear." The night deepened in Emma's hospital room. The fluorescent light dimmed to a soft glow. Emma stirred in her sleep, the towel still tucked around her shoulders. Bruno lay at the foot of the bed, his body curved protectively around her small frame. Each time she whimpered in her dreams, he lifted his head, pressed his nose against her blanket, and only then did she quiet. Mark watched from the doorway. For months, this child had lived in a world where safety was a story told in bedtime. Messages from a father far away. Tonight, for the first time, safety breathed beside her in fur and steady heartbeat. And outside that room, a trail of evidence waited to bring truth into the light. The rain had not let up. It fell in thin silver cords over Brighton hills, turning the streets slick and the air heavy. From the window of Riverbend General Hospital, Lieutenant Mark Daniels watched water bead down the glass like nervous fingers. He stood with his arms folded, jaw tight, while the soft beep of machines accompanied Emma Grace's breathing behind him. Bruno lay curled at the foot of the hospital bed, his ears twitching at every sound from the hall, amber eyes half closed, but never fully at rest. Earlier that evening, the USB Bruno had uncovered beneath Vanessa Hale's car seat revealed more than anyone could have expected. Mark had sat with prosecutor Alicia Ward and social worker Nora Whitman in a sterile office while the files loaded on a laptop. The text messages were damning. "Vanessa, Hale, custody is step 1. Once Liam is discredited, the deed is ours. Merritt Hall, public opinion will tilt if we push the right story. The press will take care of him. No one sides with a tenbull. Soldier absent from home. Vanessa, make him look like a negligent father. He'll lose her, and I'll gain everything." Mark's stomach had turned. Merritt Hall was a name he knew. Wealthy, late 52nds, with thinning silver hair slicked to a practiced shine. Tall and broad-shouldered, his frame still, carried traces of his football days at Yale. But his eyes told the truth. Pale gray, sharp as cut glass, cold with entitlement. Hall had made his fortune, buying foreclosed properties and flipping them for profit. He was known for his ruthless charm, the kind that seduced city councils and crushed small families. It did not surprise Mark that Hall now circled the Grace estate like a vulture. Still, Vanessa must have realized the noose was tightening, because sometime near midnight, Riverbend Hospital's stillness cracked. Mark had dozed lightly in the visitor's chair when Bruno's head shot up, nostrils flaring. A low growl vibrated from the dog's chest, not loud, but certain. Emma stirred, half whimpering in her sleep. "What is it, boy?" Mark whispered. Bruno padded to the door, nose pressed near the crack at the floor. Then he bolted toward the paws stairwell. Mark's instincts fired. He rose, hand to his holster, and hurried after him. The stairwell smelled faintly, perhaps of damp clothes and industrial cleaner. Bruno's growl deepened, reverberating in the concrete space. At the second landing, Mark caught movement. A shadowed figure moving fast, clutching something under one arm. A man, lean but tall, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. "Stop! Police!" Mark's voice echoed. The man didn't stop. He shoved open the stairwell door and sprinted into the parking garage. Footsteps, slapping against wet concrete. Mark cursed under his breath and chased. Bruno flew ahead, paws hammering the ground, muscles rippling under his vest. He had already locked on to the scent. The intruder was Ethan Cole. Mark knew. The face, even before the hood fell back. Mid-30 seconds, angular jaw with a rough stubble, his dark hair slick from rain. His eyes were wild, green, but shadowed by exhaustion and reckless greed. Ethan had grown up in Brighton Hills, but always on the edges, working odd jobs until Merritt Hall pulled him into his commandee's orbit. Hall valued Ethan's willingness to get dirty, to do what others wouldn't. It had made Ethan both useful and disposable. "Get back here, Cole!" Mark shouted, his boots pounding after him. Ethan darted between cars, slipping, on wet pavement, scrambling upright again. He clutched the duffel bag tight. Bruno barked once, sharp, then lunged, snapping at Ethan's heels. Ethan swung wildly, nearly tripping. "Get off me, mutt!" he snarled. He hurled a metal flashlight from his pocket. Bruno dodged, teeth bared, then lunged again. The chase spilled out of the garage and into the deserted streets. The rain drove hard now, turning the chase into a blur of headlights and shadows. Mark's lungs burned, but he kept his stride. Ethan leapt over puddles, darted down an alley, and crossed into the outskirts where neon motel signs flickered against the dark. The Blue Lantern Motel squatted at the edge of town, peeling paint, buzzing vacancy sign, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour. The parking lot rire of damp asphalt and cigarette smoke. Ethan bolted toward the stairwell of the motel. Bruno cut across the lot, intercepting him with military precision. The shepherd launched forward, clamped his jaws around Ethan's forearm, and yanked hard. Ethan cried out, stumbling, his duffel bag crashing to the ground. His phone flew from his pocket, skidding across the wet pavement. Bruno released, standing, guard, hackles raised. Mark caught up seconds later, weapon drawn, but voice controlled. On the ground, Cole. Now, Ethan hesitated, clutching his bleeding arm, eyes darting toward the phone, lying just beyond Bruno's paws. "Don't even think about it," Mark warned. But Ethan was desperate. He lunged toward the phone. Bruno barked and knocked him back, paws striking his chest. Ethan gasped, wind knocked out and crumpled to the ground. Mark cuffed him quickly, rain ashing over both of them. "You just bought yourself a long night," he muttered. He retrieved the phone carefully, slipping it into an evidence bag. The screen had cracked, but messages glowed through. A group chat, threads of planning, venom, and words. "Ethan, got the kid tonight. Taking her back, Vanessa. Good. No more delays. Hall says the press release goes out at dawn. Merritt Hall, push the soldier negligence angle. The media will eat it. Up." Mark's stomach tightened. It wasn't only about the estate anymore. It was a full-scale smear campaign designed to strip Liam Grace of honor, custody, and reputation in one blow. Bruno nudged the evidence bag in Mark's hand, then looked up, rain dripping from his ears. The dogs seemed to know they had something vital. "Good work, partner," Mark whispered, giving Bruno's fur a firm stroke. "Couldn't have done this without you." The motel's neon buzzed faintly, a reminder of the kind of shadows men like Ethan and Merritt preferred. Tonight, though, the rain had washed a little truth into the open. By the time backup arrived, Ethan was trembling in the back of a squad car, handcuffed and silent. Mark leaned against the cruiser, soaked to the bone, Bruno sitting loyally at his side. His pulse was still high, adrenaline humming, but a grim satisfaction sat beneath it. The evidence they now held, the USB, the paper, Ethan's phone, painted a clear picture. Vanessa and Merritt's greed, Ethan's desperation, and Emma caught in the crossfire. Back at the hospital, Emma slept on, unaware of the storm her bravery had set into motion. But the night had shifted. The enemy had shown its face, and Mark Daniels, with Bruno at his side, had every intention of hunting it to the very end. By dawn the following morning, Brighton Hills was drenched in headlines. Newsstands brimmed with tabloids, their glossy covers screaming across the street corners. Stepmothers. Sacrifice. How Vanessa Hale cared for a child left behind. Solders' daughter. Abandoned local woman saves her. Photograph staged with deliberate cruelty. showed Vanessa sitting at Emma's bedside in earlier months, smiling sweetly as if she were a nurturing angel. In one shot, she brushed Emma's hair. In another, she adjusted a blanket. To the uninformed eye, it was the picture of devotion. Mark Daniels gritted his teeth as he scrolled through the stories on his phone. He sat in the police precinct, conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing above. Bruno curled at his boots. The shepherd let out a low sigh, sensing his handler's tension. Across the table, Elysia Ward looked up from a thick folder of evidence. Her sharp gray eyes, framed by dark curls pinned back loosely, were sharper than any headline. She had been up all night drafting motions, her trench coat still draped over the chair. "Don't take the bait," she said firmly, voice low but sure. "They want you rattled, Lieutenant. Let the evidence speak." Mark nodded grimly. "They're painting Vanessa as a saint, Merritt Hall as her respectable ally, and Emma, she's just a pawn in their story." Alicia leaned back, arms crossed. "Then we'll show the court the truth. Give me everything. The USB, Ethan Cole's phone, the transcripts, I'll package it airtight." Later that afternoon, in a stately courtroom draped with oak paneling, Judge Eleanor Shaw presided. She was in her early 52s, a tall woman with striking posture and an iron gay bob that cut neatly at her chin. Her black robe hung loosely over broad shoulders, and her eyes, blue and unblinking, swept the courtroom with the air of someone who had spent decades slicing lies from truth. Judge Shaw had earned her reputation for fairness, through battles against both corporations and criminal enterprises. She had little patience for theatrics, but she carried a subtle kindness for children that even her stern demeanor could not fully hide. Mark stood at attention, Bruno at his side. As Alicia presented the evidence, she described the text messages, Merritt Hall's involvement, Ethan Cole's failed attempt at abduction. Then she requested a search warrant for the Hale estate, citing clear and present danger to the welfare of a minor. Judge Shaw's gavel struck once, motion granted, execute immediately. By evening, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles wound up the manicured drive of the Hale mansion. Rain still fell, turning the lawn slick and reflective under flashing blue lights. Mark led the entry team, bulletproof vests snug against his chest, Bruno moving alertly at his heel. Inside, chandeliers glittered over empty dining tables. Servants had retreated to corners, pale-faced and silent. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Mark directed the team toward the study, an expansive room lined with shelves of leather-bound books. It smelled faintly of old wood polish, but Bruno froze halfway in, nose twitching. He padded to the far wall where a bookshelf stood slightly ajar, dust disturbed at the base. Mark followed. "What do you have, partner?" Bruno pawed once at the lower shelf, then pressed his nose against the seam. Mark pulled. The shelf swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a cramped office smelling of harsh chemicals, acetone, varnish, solvents. In the center sat a desk with a small external hard drive, wires still connected. One of the officers slipped on gloves and bagged the drive. Mark read the hastily scribbled notes pinned to a corkboard. Dates, figures, property addresses. At the top, the words, Grace Estate Transfer Plan. Mark's stomach turned. This was the heart of the conspiracy. The proof that Vanessa and Merritt had plotted to strip Emma of everything her father had left. Bruno sat by the desk, tail curled neatly, amber eyes fixed on his handler, as if to say, "We found it, now use it." That night, while the mansion's lights dimmed under police tape, Emma was moved to Cedar House, a temporary shelter for children in crisis. Cedar House was a modest brick building on the edge of town, painted in warm cream with shutters of faded blue. The interior smelled faintly of cookies and lemon cleaner, a strange but comforting mix. Murals of trees and rivers brightened the walls. For many children, it was the first place they felt seen. Emma Grace sat on a soft couch, her brown dress exchanged for a hospital-issued sweatshirt, her crutch propped beside her. Her eyes still carried the haunted look of someone who expected the world to break her again. But when Bruno padded into the room, her face changed, her lips trembling into the faintest smile. "Hi, Bruno," she whispered. The shepherd trotted to her, lowering himself so that his great head could rest on her lap. Emma's small fingers dug into his fur, and she leaned against him with a sigh that sounded like surrender, not to fear, but to safety. Mark watched quietly from the doorway. He had never believed in angels, but if one had ever worn fur, it was now stretched across Emma's lap. Over the following days, the storm of media and legal maneuvers continued. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Vanessa released statements proclaiming her innocence. Merritt's lawyers threatened defamation suits. But inside Cedar House, time slowed. Every evening, Mark returned after his shift, Bruno bounding ahead of him. And every evening, Emma waited, her crutch nearby, determination lighting her hazel eyes. She wanted to practice walking again. At first, her steps were shaky, legs trembling under the weight of expectation. She gritted her teeth, sweat beading at her brow. Then Bruno did something unexpected. The dog flopped onto his side theatrically, rolled onto his back with his paws in the air, and gave a goofy huff. Emma blinked, then laughed, a bubbling, startled laugh she hadn't made in months. She steadied herself against her crutch, giggling as Bruno wriggled in. Exaggerated clumsiness. "You're silly," she said, smiling wide. Mark leaned against the wall, throat tight. That laugh had been worth every sleepless night. Emma managed 3 steps before, collapsing onto the couch, still laughing. Bruno licked her hand triumphantly as though he just scored. The victory of his life. In the middle of lawsuits, headlines, and schemes, a child had found her laugh again. And Mark Daniels knew the matter more than any court filing ever could. Dawn crept over Brighton Hills with the thin light of winter, pale and uncertain, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. At Cedar House, the modest brick shelter for children in crisis, the air was heavy with silence. The staff stirred, quietly in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The house smelled faintly of oatmeal and warm bread. Emma Grace had woken earlier than usual, wrapped in a knitted scarf of faded pink, one of the few personal things she had been allowed to keep. She sat on her bed, staring at the window pane misted by her breath. She traced a circle on the glass, then whispered Bruno's name under her breath. The dog always came at night, steady as a clock, lying at her side until sleep claimed her. For Emma, Bruno was no longer just a K9. He was proof the world still held loyalty. But this morning, loyalty was far from the front gate. 2 men slipped across the frost-tipped lawn in silence. The taller one carried himself with the confidence of money and power. Merritt Hall, the silver-haired real estate mogul, wore a long wool coat, its collar turned up against the cold. His face was square with a jaw that once commanded locker rooms, but time had hardened his expression into something colder. His gray eyes scanned Cedar House with disdain, as if the building itself offended him. Beside him moved Ethan Cole, younger, wiry, with a hood pulled low. His green eyes were restless, darting between the windows and the ground. His jaw was unshaven, skin pale from too many nights awake. Ethan's loyalty was not to Merritt, not really. It was to the promise of money, of being seen by someone powerful. And fear, always fear, drove him harder than loyalty ever could. "Quick, Merritt," muttered, voice low and clipped. "In and out. We use her as leverage." Daniel's hands over the USB. They slipped through. A side door Ethan had jimmied open the night before. Inside, the halls were dim. Emma heard nothing before hands clamped over her mouth. Her muffled scream dissolved into the early light. An hour later, Lieutenant Mark Daniels stood at the Brighton Hills precinct, sipping coffee gone cold. He hadn't yet visited Emma this morning, planning to check on her after filing a report with Elysia Ward. Bruno sat by his side, tail flicking slowly, restless. The call came over the radio, sharp and urgent. Cedar House reports missing juvenile Emma Grace, possible abduction. Mark's blood went ice cold. He dropped the coffee and was moving before the cup shattered. Bruno leapt up, ears rigid, as if he too had heard Emma's cry across the distance. They were already in the SUV when a staff member from Cedar House arrived with something in hand. Emma's pink scarf dropped on the ground near the fence. The wool was damp with morning frost. Mark crouched, lifting the scarf. "Bruno, find her." The shepherd inhaled deeply, nose quivering, then pulled taut against the lead, straining northward. His tail stiffened, his body tense with purpose. Mark didn't need more. He drove after Bruno's pull, following the dog's instincts as much as the map. The trail led them through back roads where fog hung heavy over fields. Bruno wed softly, his nose pressed against the cracked window. Finally, they crested a hill, and the wide gray, an expanse of Silverleaf Lake stretched below. Its surface was veiled with mist, the water half frozen, surrounded by pine forest. Tracks cut into the frost near the lake's edge, tire marks fresh. Bruno barked sharply and bounded toward them. Mark followed, gun awe, body tense. He caught sight of a battered van parked near the tree. Its side door was locked. A shadow moved inside. "Emma!" he shouted. A muffled sound answered, small, panicked. Mark's heart hammered. From the woods, a figure stepped forward. A hired guard, mid-4 seconds, burly, wearing a black beanie and heavy jacket. His skin was weathered, beard thick and matted, and his eyes were dull. The eyes of someone who obeyed orders without thinking. He gripped a baseball bat. Bruno moved before Mark did. The shepherd lunged, a blur of tan and black. His teeth sank into the man's arm, forcing him to drop the bat with a howl. The man tried to shove him off, but Bruno's weight was immovable. His growl rumbling like thunder, Mark sprinted past them, kicking the bat aside and reached the van. He smashed the window with his elbow, ignoring the sting of glass, and unlocked the door. From within. Inside, Emma sat bound at the wrists, eyes wide with terror. Her crutch had been tossed aside. "It's all right," Mark said, voice low, steady. He cut the ropes, lifted her gently into his arms, and pulled his own jacket around her trembling body. "You're safe? I've got you." Emma buried her face against his chest, sobbing softly. Mark reached down, retrieved her crutch, and placed it in her small hand. "This is yours. No one takes it from you again." The words landed heavier than he expected, like returning a crown. Emma clutched the crutch as if he had just returned her name. By the time backup arrived, Bruno had the guard pinned, his collar cam recording everything. Mark's own body cam had captured the break-in, the rescue, Emma's condition. Together, the footage painted a story no tabloid could twist. A frightened child abducted by greedy hands and a canine's loyalty, anchoring the truth. Merritt and Ethan had vanished deeper into the woods before the squad cars arrived, but their trail was now undeniable. And Emma, wrapped in Mark's jacket, her hand curled into Bruno's fur, was no longer just a frightened child. She was the living witness to all they had done. The lake mist curled around them like smoke, the morning sun fighting to break through. Mark looked out over the frozen water and knew this wasn't the end. But, for today, Emma was free, and that mattered more than everything else. The courthouse in Westchester County stood like a monument of stone and time, its limestone facade weathered but imposing, pillars rising tall against a sky the color of pewter. Inside, the air was hushed yet electric, the kind of silence that came when lives would be reshaped by the weight of law. Lieutenant Mark Daniels sat at the witness table, his uniform pressed, though his eyes bore the shadows of too many sleepless nights. Beside his boots lay Bruno, steady as stone, ears alert. The shepherd's vest carried the tiny black collar cam that had already become infamous across the county, a camera that had captured a child's freedom and a criminal's fall. At the defendant's table sat 3 figures, each a portrait of disgrace. Vanessa Hale wore a navy dress, sleek and sharp, as if clothing could restore what reputation had already burned away. Her blonde hair was pinned high, but stray strands clung damply to her temples. Her face, once so quick to smile at cameras, was tight with rage. She could barely suppress. Her pale hands clenched and unclenched in her lap, betraying the storm behind her cold eyes. Beside her sat Merritt Hall, broad-shouldered in a tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was combed immaculately, his jaw still strong, but the arrogance that once carried him into boardrooms had cracked. His pale gray eyes darted nervously toward the rows of reporters seated in the back, as if he could still bend their pens with a glance. And on the far side, slouched and sullen, sat Ethan Cole. His hoodie had been replaced by county-issued khakis, but his wiry frame looked smaller in the sterile light. His green eyes shifted constantly, sometimes with defiance, sometimes with regret, as though he wasn't sure which mask fit anymore. His stubble had thickened into a patchy beard, and his lips chewed at themselves until they bled. The prosecution's table belonged to Alicia Ward, who stood tall in a black pants suit, hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. Her sharp features radiated a calm fire. Alicia had built her career dismantling fraud cases, and she now held in her hands the chance to tear apart a conspiracy that had tried to devour a child. The presiding judge entered with a rustle of robes. Judge Eleanor Shaw, tall, silver-bobbed hair tucked neatly behind her ears, radiated an aura of calm authority. Her blue eyes scanned the room as though daring anyone to waste her time. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The evidence came first. Alicia Ward walked the jury through each piece like bricks. in a wall. The USB drive containing Vanessa and Merritt's damning messages. The hard drive from the Hale estate. Its spreadsheets and emails mapping out property transfers linked to Emma's name. Ethan's phone recovered by Bruno with its group chat detailing the smear campaign. And then the crown jewel, the footage Mark's body cam flickered to life on the screen, showing the rain-lashed rescue at Silverleaf Lake. Emma's muffled cries, Mark smashing the van, the door, Bruno pinning the guard. It all played in stark clarity. Then the view shifted to Bruno's collar cam, the angle, slightly lower, showing the child being lifted from the van, clinging to her crutch, pressing her small body against Mark's chest. The jury leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. The defendant squirmed. Vanessa hissed under her breath. This is edited, but her voice carried, and Judge Shaw's gavel cracked like thunder. Silence in my court. During recess, Mark stepped out, into the hall. Emma waited with her guardian, Nora Whitman, the social worker who had been her constant anchor. Nora, mid-40s, auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, wore a long cardigan over slacks. Her gentle but steady presence had soothed Emma through medical exams and depositions. Emma sat at a small table in the corner, a box of crayons scattered before her. Her brown hair was brushed neatly today, though a few strands still curled rebelliously at her temples. She leaned on her crutch, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When she saw Mark, her eyes lit. "Look," she said softly. She held up a drawing. The paper showed a long, winding road stretching into the distance. On one end stood a small figure with a crutch. Emma, her face drawn in careful strokes. On the far end stood Bruno, his ears pointed, tail wagging, waiting. Above the path, rays of yellow and orange sunlight broke through, scattering light across the page. "I called it the road with light," she whispered. Mark swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. "It's beautiful, Emma." Emma nodded seriously. "If Bruno waits at the end, I think I can walk 2 more steps, maybe 3. Bruno, as if understanding, nudged her crutch with his nose, then pressed his head against her knee. Emma giggled softly, the sound, like the chime of something fragile, rediscovered. Nora glanced at Mark, her eyes wet but smiling. "She's found hope. Again. That's more than I ever expected to see this soon." Back in the courtroom, the defense sputtered weakly. Vanessa's lawyer spoke of misunderstandings and doctored evidence. Merritt's attorney tried to cast him as a victim of manipulation. Ethan's public defender muttered about poor judgment under pressure, but Alicia Ward's rebuttal was steel. She raised her voice only once, pointing to Bruno as he lay quietly at Mark's feet. "That dog," she said, "is incapable of lying. His collar cam recorded what your clients hoped no one would ever see. You can smear a soldier. You can trick a child, but you cannot rewrite the lens of truth." The words rippled through the gallery. For the first time, Vanessa looked shaken. Merritt's shoulders sagged. Ethan dropped his gaze. The verdict came. Swiftly. Judge Shaw's voice was clear, decisive. "Vanessa Hale, Merritt Hall, Ethan Cole. You stand accused of child abuse, conspiracy to defraud, and kidnapping. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Emma Grace is hereby granted emergency protection. None of you will be permitted contact. Further, a financial investigation into Mr. Hall's dealings as ordered, effective immediately." The gavel struck. Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber. Reporters rushed out to file, breaking headlines. But amid the noise, Emma leaned against Bruno, whispering into his fur, "You're my hero." And across Brighton Hills, the tide of public opinion shifted. Articles praised Bruno as the silent hero. Editorials spoke of faith restored in justice. Children across the county sent letters addressed simply to Bruno, the brave dog. Mark stood quietly, letting the moment belong to Emma. For all the chaos, this was what mattered. A little girl, a crutch in her hand, and a German shepherd who had given her the courage to believe the road ahead was not only possible, but bright. The morning air at JFK International Airport was sharp and cold, the kind of winter bite that stung cheeks and numbed fingertips. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, frosting the tarmac and turning the horizon pale. From the belly of a gray military transport plane, soldiers descended one by one, boots heavy on steel stairs, their uniforms worn by sand and wind from faraway deserts. Among them walked Staff Sergeant Liam Grace. Liam was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame built by years of service and the daily weight of discipline. His face was sunburned, the tan uneven against pale lines where goggles had shielded his eyes. His dark brown hair was clipped short, stray, with a few strands of premature gray, and his jaw carried a rough shadow of stubble. What stood out most were his eyes, hazel green, steady yet haunted eyes that had watched his comrades fall, that had seen more dusk than dawn. Liam's movements were deliberate, his gait strong but weary. Around his neck hung a pair of dented dog tags, clinking softly with each step. He carried only one bag slung over at his shoulder, the kind of man who had learned long ago not to keep more than he could lose. Waiting at the security gate was Lieutenant Mark Daniels, standing tall in his uniform, Bruno at his side. The German shepherd's ears pricked up the moment Liam appeared, and Bruno's tail swept once, twice. As if even the dog understood the gravity of this reunion, Mark stepped forward. "Sergeant Grace." Liam extended his hand. His grip was iron, firm, but shaking slightly with emotion. "Lieutenant Daniels, I don't know how to thank you. They told me everything on the ride here." Mark's eyes softened. "You don't have to thank me. Bruno and we just made sure your daughter still had the chance to see you." Liam glanced down at Bruno. The dog sat proudly, amber eyes fixed on him. Liam bent, placing a calloused hand against the shepherd's head. "You kept her safe," he whispered. "You gave her what I couldn't." Bruno licked his hand once, solemn and sure. That afternoon, the snow at Maple Ridge Park melted under the faint warmth of the Sunday children, ran across the frosted grass, their laughter carrying like bells. In the center path, a line of white chalk had been drawn carefully across the pavement, stretching 20 feet from one bench to another. At one end stood Mark, crouched with a piece of chalk in his hand, his expression both encouraging and protective. Beside him, Emma Grace clutched her crutch tightly. She wore a pale blue coat, a wool hat tugged low over her ears, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. At 8 years old, she looked small against the vastness of the park, but her hazel eyes glowed with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her age. At the far end of the chalk line sat Bruno, perfectly still, his tail sweeping slowly across the ground. He was the finish line, the promise, the goal. His eyes never left Emma, as if silently telling her, "I'll be here, just walk." And beside Bruno, waiting, with arms open, was Liam Grace. Emma took a breath. She pressed her crutch down, lifted one small foot, and stepped onto the chalk line. The world held its breath with her. One step, then another. Her body wavered, knees trembling, but she kept her gaze fixed on Bruno and the tall figure beyond. 2 more steps, she whispered to herself, repeating the vow she had made. The third step came with a stumble, her body tipping forward, and then she fell, but not onto cold ground. Strong arms caught her mid. Collapse. "Daddy!" Her cry tore through the park, breaking something in every onlooker's chest. Liam held her close, his rough hands trembling as they clutched her small frame. Tears burned down his wind-chapped face, soaking into her wool hat. "Emma," he whispered hoarsely, "I'm here now. I'll never leave you again. Never," Emma sobbed, clutching at his uniform. "I walked." "Daddy." Bruno waited for me. Liam pressed his forehead to hers. "And I'll wait for you too. Every step, every day." Mark stood back, his throat tight, watching father and daughter fold into each other like pieces of a broken puzzle finally set right. Bruno trotted forward, pressing his nose into Emma's side, tail wagging gently. For the first time in months, Emma laughed through her tears. The days that followed blurred with decisions and signatures, hearings and paperwork. But the final ruling came, swiftly. Judge Ella Lanner Shaw, stern as always, declared Liam Grace the rightful guardian of his daughter. Vanessa's rights were terminated, Merritt's finances investigated, Ethan remanded for sentencing. The courthouse was quieter this time. Reporters took their notes without spectacle, but outside, the community that had once whispered doubt now stood in support. Letters began to pour in, filling the small rented house on the edge of Brighton Hills. Packages arrived with Emma's name scrawled across them, children's drawings of Crutches sprouting wings, hand-knit scarves woven with prayers, and cards that said only, "You're safe now." The house was humble, its white paint peeling, but warmth lived inside. Emma's room glowed soft yellow, her crutch resting neatly by the wall. At the foot of her bed sat a new dog bed, though Bruno rarely used it, choosing instead to curl at Emma's side, guarding her dreams. Each morning began the same: therapy. Dr. Clara Mitchell, auburn hair, tied back, voice steady and patient, stood with a stopwatch. "One more step, Emma. Steady now." And Emma, jaw clenched with fierce determination, pushed forward. Every stumble was met by Bruno padding ahead, amber eyes locked on hers, waiting like a beacon. She always reached him. One evening, Dusk painted Maple Ridge, violet, and gold. Crayons sprawled across the table. Emma sketched furiously, while Liam watered plants and Mark sipped coffee. Bruno lay under the table, ears twitching at every sound. Emma finally lifted her drawing 4 figures, walking a glowing path. A soldier, a policeman, a child with a crutch, and a German shepherd beneath rays of light breaking through storm clouds. "It's called The Road Home," she whispered. Liam pulled her onto his lap, kissing her hair. Mark leaned closer, eyes soft, Bruno's tail thumping against the floor. But just as peace seemed to settle, headlights cut through the window blinds. Tires crunched the gravel drive. The laughter in the room stilled. Bruno rose first, body tense, a low growl in his chest. Mark's hand slipped instinctively to his holster. Liam froze, shielding Emma behind him. The world outside had not forgotten them. Shadows still lingered, cruelty still prowled. Yet here, in this fragile sanctuary, light refused to surrender. And maybe that was the lesson. Justice is not a single strike of a gavel, nor healing a single step. It is choosing, again and again, to stand, to guard, to believe. Sometimes miracles don't blaze like fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a German shepherd braced against the door, as a policeman refusing to let evil cross the threshold, or as a father's arms around a trembling child. Emma's story reminds us, even when darkness returns, God sends the right people, and sometimes His creatures to shield us, to guide us, to carry us home. If you believe His light still shines through love, loyalty, and faith, share this story. Let one more heart discover hope. And as we wait for what comes next, remember, no step is ever too small when taken together in His light.